The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, my name is Ellie Johnston. I'm the Climate and Energy Lead at Climate Interactive, and you all are joining the World Climate Simulation webinar. Over the next hour, we'll go through what the World Climate Simulation is and how you can lead it for groups that you work with. So hope you're in the right place. And a few notes on the webinar platform. There's a questions box, and that's your best way to communicate with me. You can write in questions and comments there, and I'll see them. I'll check that periodically. Happy to keep this interactive and really tune it to whatever context or specific questions that you have. So feel free to write in there as we go. I'll also ask for your input at different points. So be ready for that as well. But let's get started. So the World Climate Simulation is a role-playing exercise that has been played with thousands and thousands of people all over the world, different groups. And the way it works is people play negotiators from different countries and then work to create a global climate agreement that hopefully limits warming to well below 2 degrees, as is outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement. So that's the context for which this simulation happens. 2015, all the countries of the world came together and they agreed on the Paris Climate Agreement. And to date, every nation in the world, except for Nicaragua and Syria, have signed the agreement. And of course, many of you all may be well aware of the news coming out of the United States, here where I am, that our president has expressed interest in withdrawing from the agreement. So we'll see how that plays out over the next few years. But this is the game, and the UN climate negotiations are kind of this abstract event. And so for many people, this role-playing exercise provides a way to make them more real and make the experience of all these negotiators you see in this picture come to life a little more. And as I mentioned, the World Climate Simulation has been played by thousands of people, over 30,000 people all over the world in more than 70 different countries. We have the materials for this game available in many different languages, from Chinese and Turkish to Spanish and French and German. So if you are working with an audience in a different country that speaks a different language, check it out. And a lot of those materials that have been translated are thanks to people like you who have taken an interest in this effort and done the translations themselves. So that's really great. And yeah, do write in if you have any problems hearing me or seeing things. Hopefully the slides are moving at this point. I've been scrolling through them. So first off, how does this World Climate Simulation work? Well, just as a quick overview, typically the simulation lasts from 2 to 3.5 hours. Start with an introduction and then an opening by someone playing, perhaps the UN Secretary General, and then a first round of negotiations followed by speeches and checking the results, the policies that have been proposed, and then a second round of negotiations, and then again checking the results to see the progress that has been made, and then the debrief section. So I'll go into these a little in a little more detail as we go along. But typically, we run World Climate in 2 different modes, either with 3 regions or with 6 regions. And so in 3-region mode, you have one group that plays the developed countries, another group that plays the rapidly emerging economies like China and India and Brazil and South Africa. And then you have another group representing everyone else, least developed countries, small island states, those kind of countries. And we work hard in setting up the room in a very particular way. So you'll see there are donuts associated with the United States or comfortable chairs with the developed countries. And so as you set up the room, if you do these kinds of things, it helps highlight the different power differences that exist within our world. We have wealthy countries that are coming to the table beside countries that have very little to be able to offer the international community. And the conversation around climate is also a conversation about how the historic responsibility of the developed countries to help the smaller nations adjust to the impacts of climate change. I see one person writing in that says they don't see any slides at all. Can others see the slides that they're changing? The top of the slide I'm looking at right now says 6 regions. Do you all see that? No slides, so it's not visible. Do you all see anything at all? Got you. Let's see. How about now? Do you all see slides now? Yes, there we go. Got it. Perfect. Okay, excellent. Sorry about that. So here, what you're looking at is the 6 different groups. So in the 6 region mode, you have the United States, you have the European Union, then you have a group of all the other developed countries beyond the US and the EU, Japan, New Zealand, Russia, etc. And then you have a group that plays China, a group that plays India, and a group that plays all of the other countries, much of Africa, Asia, the small island nations, etc. And so these 6 different groups, they're given briefing statements and then asked to sit within their group and introduce themselves. Here's a picture of 2 different world climate simulations. You see in the bottom right-hand corner there that there are 7 women there sitting on the floor. They're playing the least developed countries. And sometimes we will not give groups chairs to, again, further highlight the different power differences that exist within a room. And, to make this a challenging experience for everyone, what we also often do is ask people to play a role that is outside of their experience. So, for example, if I'm working with a group that is very international and comes from different countries, I'll ask those that come from developed countries to play the developing countries, and then I'll ask those who are playing who come from developing countries to play the developed countries. So that way, people get an opportunity to try on a different role and to think about the dynamics that come from that role. Each group is given briefing statements so that they can get some background on what their country's negotiating position is and any kind of historical information. This enables you to run the world climate simulation with groups who maybe don't know very little about climate change, know very little about the countries that they're going to play. You just need to give them a few minutes to read over these briefing statements, and it will help bring them up to speed. And again, as the facilitator, we encourage people to take on the role of either the UN Secretary General or the UNFCCC Executive Secretary. So this would be the lead of the climate change negotiations, and to play that role as best you can. So that might mean that after your introductory remarks, after you've given everybody their briefing statements and they're reading them, that you step out of the room and go change your clothes, maybe put on very formal business attire, a suit and a tie, or a scarf. I oftentimes will carry a blazer and put that on. And sometimes I'll even ask somebody to formally welcome me back into the room. So have an assistant say, everyone please rise for UNFCCC Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa, and then everyone sort of laughs as you walk in the room. But it's good to bring a little lightheartedness to the exercise, and it makes it fun and helps everyone else get into their roles as they play negotiators from different countries that they don't normally. After the introductory remarks, teams meet to discuss their opening positions. They begin to set their policies and what they're advocating for, and then they submit those pledges to the UN through speeches that they give, where they outline their position, and they write these up on the board. Here's an example of what these proposals look like. And then we enter them into the C-ROADS policy simulator, C-ROADS World Climate. So let's take a minute to look at that. And so this is, before I do that, this is the proposal summary table. And you'll see here that for each group, US, EU, other developed, etc., that they come up with 6 different things. 1, the year in which their greenhouse gas emissions will peak. So if we don't take any action at all on climate change, every country's emissions is expected to continue to rise throughout the end of the century. But in a situation in which we're taking action on climate, the first thing emissions need to do is they need to stop growing. They need to peak. Then the second is what year emissions then begin to reduce and at what rate. So sometimes people ask, well, what's a reasonable rate? And I say, well, 5% would be an extremely fast rate. Typically, and it says on the back of the briefing statements, the UN Environmental Program has said that 3.5% would be pretty ambitious. So somewhere in that range. And then they can come up with the amount of effort that they're putting towards reducing deforestation, and then an amount that they're putting towards planting new trees and creating new forests, which is afforestation. And then finally, we ask groups to come up with how much money they are either contributing to the Green Climate Fund or requesting from the Green Climate Fund. And in the Paris Agreement, countries established that their goal was to mobilize at least $100 billion per year in climate financing. So you can set that as a bar in which groups should aspire towards, and also encourage those countries who don't have the means to request money from that. So what this means a lot of times is that US, EU, and other developed countries will contribute money, and that India and the other developing countries will request money. Sometimes China will request money, sometimes China gives money. It really just depends on how people are playing the role of the Chinese negotiators on any given day. And then let's go take a look at C-ROADS World Climate, and you all can see what this looks like. So this is freely available from the Climate Interactive website. We developed this software simulator in partnership with the MIT Sloan School of Management. And it's a simulator that is used for analysis that is actually used by negotiators within the climate negotiations. We do an exercise where we add up all of the pledges that countries have actually made to the negotiations and have report that out to the world, and have done a number of other things with it. Most recently, the New York Times, for example, featured an interactive tool that we use C-ROADS to run all the different results for, and then help the New York Times design this interactive. So this is used for a lot of applications outside of the World Climate Simulation, but World Climate Simulation is definitely one of the more popular ways in which people come to C-ROADS. And so what you're looking at here is the C-ROADS main interface, and this is what it looks like generally when you open it up. On the left, you have fossil fuel emissions from the year 2000 to 2100. Then on the right, you have temperature change from the year 2000 out to 2100. Everything right now is set as kind of the business as usual, or what we call the reference scenario. And you can see here that without taking action, we're on a trajectory towards 4.2 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. And over here are the lines of each of the different countries represented. So you can see emissions growing for all the different regions. And the challenge then is, how do we reduce these emissions? And C-ROADS also is, I mentioned that we have a 3-region version and a 6-region version of World Climate. So you can just go under simulation here and switch over to 3-region if you're using the 3-region mode, or you can even look at just a global 1-region mode. C-ROADS is also available in a number of different languages. So currently we have it in French, German, Spanish, Turkish, and Japanese. And then there are also a lot of other graphs that you can explore. So you have lots of graphs looking at, things like CO2 removals, deforestation, or emissions per GDP, all kinds of different things that you can explore on your own. But so just looking at the three region really quick, I'll show you how to enter in some of the results. So for example, if we're talking about the developed countries, what year do you think that they need to peak their emissions and then begin to decline their emissions to reach the global goal of staying below 2 degrees? You can just type that into the questions box. What year do you think that developed countries need to peak their emissions? 2017, perfect. All right, well, they should do it this year. And then what year? We'll just say that they begin to reduce their emissions in 2017 too. You saw that as I entered in 2017 for emissions peak year, this red line representing developed countries became flat. And then I could say, well, maybe they reduced their emissions and at, I don't know, 3%. I'm just putting in a number here. And then you can see as I enter that in, then now the emissions for the developed countries are declining 3% per year. How about for our rapidly emerging economies? We call these developing A. This is China, India, South Africa. What year do you think they should peak their emissions to stay below 2 degrees? 2030. Great. Let's see here. So 2030 is also the year in which China has said that they're planning to peak their emissions. So this is a good fit. And as I enter that in, watch that green line. And that comes down. And you see that as I'm entering in these pledges, the temperature goes down too. And you see this purple line separating from the black line, bringing temperature down as well. Let's say for our everyone else in the world, so our developing B countries, this includes over 100 nations, Southeast Asia, Central and South America, Africa. What year should they peak their emissions? $2035? Okay, sure. Check that in. And then for going back to our rapidly emerging economies, we could set a year in which they begin to decline. Maybe they begin to decline 5 years later in 2035 at maybe 2% per year. And you can see as this line begins to come down, that emissions keep bending down too. And you can keep entering in different pledges and to see what the results are. And so if you're playing the World Climate Simulation, you're facilitating, you would have each of your groups announce their policies and any stipulations that go along with those policies. So sometimes, for example, the developing B group or the other developing group might come up to the front of the room and say, well, if we get $20 billion in financing, we can then peak our emissions in this year and then begin to reduce. And if they come forward with some kind of stipulation like that, I oftentimes will not enter in their pledge unless there is actually the money from the other countries there to make that happen, or have them tell me when to enter it, because sometimes that financing can then become an important piece of the role playing exercise. But there's lots of ways to run it to make it work for you. So do let me know if you have any questions about that, and we can come back to C-roads later and play around with different scenarios if you'd like to explore that. So like I said, we check our results, and then we also, a lot of times too, we talk about different dynamics that we see when we're looking at C-roads. So here is a picture of the founder of Climate Interactive, Drew Jones. He's in China explaining what we call the bathtub concept. So this is one thing we refer to a lot because it helps people understand the role of emissions in terms of thinking about climate change. So I ask people and ask you all, think about a bathtub. You have the tap, in which the water flows into the bathtub, and you have the drain where the water flows out. And the rate at which water flows into the bathtub, you could think of that as like emissions. And then the rate at which water flows out of the bathtub through the drain, you could think of that as removals. And generally, what do you do to fill up a bathtub? Well, you plug up the drain and you make sure that the emissions or the tap the water is flowing in there much faster than is flowing out. But if you want the level of the bathtub to go down, then you would have the drain wide open and the tap turned off, and that would make the level go down. Currently, in our atmosphere, emissions are going into the atmosphere about twice as fast as they're being removed. So therefore, the level of CO2 and the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere is going up. It's a simple concept that when we use the analogy of the bathtub, even young kids can understand it. So I would encourage talking about that. And then one way you can see that show up in C-roads, if we go back to C-roads, we can look at, if we go to graphs, and then we can go to removals, CO2 emissions and removals. You can see here, this is a graph. In gray here are our emissions, and then green are our removals. And with the scenario that we had just plugged in here, we hadn't stabilized, the temperature increase is continuing to rise. And we can go look at our CO2 levels, and we can see that we can look at global greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that our emissions, they're starting to come down, but they're not enough. So if I go back over to what I was looking at before, the CO2 emissions right here, we got them to flatten, we got them to come down, but they're still higher than removals. So that means that flow into the bathtub is still happening at a faster rate than how much is draining out of our atmospheric bathtub. Therefore, CO2 concentration will rise, which leads to continued temperature rise. If, say, we make a scenario, I'll make a scenario really quick, that gets us to that level at which emissions equal removals, you'll see that the temperature begins to level off. Like, let's see, what if developed countries begin to make serious reductions of their emissions, and these rapidly emerging countries move a little faster. And you can see here, we're now down to 2.1 degrees. That's because and you can see these lines are meeting, and the steady rise of temperature is beginning to level off because the amount of emissions is becoming equivalent to the amount of removals. And that's really the heart of addressing climate change, is making those emissions and removals come into balance, or come into being more equal. Some of the other things we bring into the world climate simulation to add different lessons to it are, sometimes we demonstrate sea level rise, and here you can see this is Professor Florian Kappmeyer, who is a teacher at a business school in Germany, and he's got this tarp, and he's physically covering up his students to simulate climate change, simulate sea level rise. Excuse me. And so go around the room and physically cover everyone up with this tarp to show how sea levels are rising. And then after you've gone through 2 rounds of negotiations, or however many rounds of negotiations you can go through with the time you have available, you have the debrief. And we think this is a really critical piece of helping people understand exactly the outcomes of the simulation and what they've learned from it. So there are a few different elements to the debrief. One, you ask people about their emotions and how they're feeling. Surprisingly, a lot of times people have a lot of feelings. They're maybe very angry, or they've gotten into heated discussions with their friends, as they're playing their roles. Maybe they're frustrated by how hard it is to get down below 2 degrees. And talking about the way people are feeling can sometimes illuminate those different insights that wouldn't be otherwise. Then also talking about the real world. So I'll also talk about what's actually happening within the UN climate negotiations. Here you can again use C-ROADS for this. So if I go back to C-ROADS here, and I'm looking at, say, the global greenhouse gas emissions, I can go under simulation. Let's see, where is it? Under view, and I can say show Paris outcomes. And then this adds this line to the graphs, and you can see that's actually, these are where the pledges that are currently on the table get us. So the pledges to date, most of the pledges only go to about 2030. So they bring us down that amount. And what will happen in the next, 60 years or so, we don't yet know, but we assume that countries hopefully will take further action so that curve can continue to bend down. But because we don't know yet, there's no policy there. And you can see that with just the policies on the table, we get to about 3.3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So you can talk about that in the debrief. And any other insights that come up. The bathtub, I mentioned, questions like how fast we need to move, social justice, any other elements that seem appropriate. And maybe you're a teacher and you teach in biology or in a specific field and maybe you want to highlight climate science here, or use this period as a chance to talk about historical responsibility. There are all different kinds of angles you can take this, depending on what's appropriate to your audience. And then also, we do encourage, the exercise itself has a lot of, because it is reflecting of the climate science that we have, to the best of our knowledge, and also the difficult politics that we face in the world in terms of taking action, can be an exercise that leaves people feeling very challenged in terms of what we must do. And we encourage you as a facilitator to think about what makes you hopeful in addressing climate change, and come up with some sort of story to share with your participants as a facilitator of, what inspires you in this work on climate change. And so for some people that could look like, highlighting how fast renewable energy is getting deployed around the world, and how cost competitive renewable energy has become in just a short amount of time. Sometimes for others, that means talking about, the history of social movements and how people have come together and been able to make huge transformations in our society throughout history, and all different kinds of things. So think about that. And then also, if it's appropriate for the group you're working with, also have a conversation about taking action and what that could look like. Maybe for a class of students, it could look like some sort of effort that they take at their school. In some cases, it has looked like students running the world climate simulation at other schools. They've really run with it in different places. If you're working with business leaders on this, it could look like looking at their supply chains or any number of different things. But again, think about what's most appropriate to your audience, and really I encourage you to explore different ways of taking action on this. I see a question here from Jessica saying that showing the Paris outcomes is really cool. Is there also a way that we can see what the rough numbers are in the commitment table to correspond to the Paris commitments? That is a great question, and a feature that I have thought about would be great for C-ROADS as well. It doesn't have it, but I will go and show you roughly my best understanding of what the pledges are. So if I go over to the 6 region mode, and generally what the pledges are. So I'm going to reset the simulation. It's already reset. But currently we have the US, the EU, and the other developed countries have more or less peaked their emissions. This is good news, and that's something that a lot of people don't realize. So we just entered in 2017 as the peaking year, and then the US and EU have pledges to reduce their emissions. And now, of course, we know the political situation in the United States. We have President Trump saying that he's going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. On the other hand, here in the United States, there's also a lot of activities happening at the state and city level where there's lots of action being taken. So it's hard to say what will come in the coming years with the US, but more or less the pledge that the Obama administration submitted, I think it's about like 3.6% per year as an annual reduction rate. And this carries through the end of the century. So currently the pledge in the United States only goes to about 2025. But if they were to do the same thing throughout, that's about the trend it would be. EU, again, they're already making reductions. I think theirs is closer to 4.1% when it's all said and done. And then the other developed countries, this is a group that includes countries like New Zealand that are taking action, but then it also includes countries like Russia, which aren't doing a whole lot. So they're not really, I don't think their emissions are coming down at this stage, so they tend to be flat. China, like I said before, has a pledge to peak their carbon dioxide emissions no later than 2030. We don't know what they're going to do afterwards, but hopefully they'll reduce them. India and the other developing countries, they don't have big pledges on the table. India has taken some steps to really accelerate their renewable energy development, so that's a promising sign. So perhaps they'll peak their emissions somewhere around 2045, and hopefully that's sooner, but we just don't know yet. And similar to the other developing countries, there's a lot of different development happening in different ways where you see countries making choices to prioritize using renewable energy over building coal-fired power plants in other cases. And you have financial institutions like the World Bank saying that they're not going to make loans for big coal generation facilities like they once did. So hopefully a lot of that growth that's expected in fossil fuel emissions from the other developing countries will be minimized as they essentially leapfrog over the dirty, polluting fossil fuel development paradigm that the US, EU, and others followed, and can instead jump onto a cleaner development pathway. All of that, of course, is to be seen, and hopefully will be a reality, but it's going to take some work. But more or less, and also in the kind of good news side of things, is that we are seeing trends that global greenhouse gas emissions are peaking. So that when I show the graph of global emissions, that we here in 2017, it's beginning to bend, and you can see, and that shows up in the Paris outcome there too. But yeah, that's generally my sense of things, and that's pretty imprecise because the pledges take other forms, but we have tried to make it simplify it some so that it's an exercise that anyone can use. And I see this question: any guidance for the Copenhagen commitments too? I would say that I don't usually even mention much about the Copenhagen commitments because they've become the Paris commitments from countries. So the policies that countries made at the Copenhagen climate negotiations in 2009 and before that and shortly thereafter, those countries have revised, and they have resubmitted what are called their nationally determined contributions for the Paris Agreement. So you could wade through and look at the old policies and compare them some if you wanted to do that, but typically we don't get into that kind of depth in a world climate simulation. Although I imagine for some policy classes. That could be an interesting exercise. And feel free to keep your questions coming. I'm about at the end of the presentation here. Let me see, what else do we have? Yeah, that is about what we have. I guess one thing I did want to show you all is just where stuff is on our website. So if you go to climateinteractive.org, here's our homepage, and you can go up here to programs, and then World Climate. And then on the World Climate Simulation page, over here on the right hand, it says Facilitators, Resources, and Materials. You can also find this if you scroll down here. Get to the Facilitators, Resources, and Materials section. There's a video here that was created by our partner at the University of Massachusetts Lowell Climate Change Initiative, also on how to facilitate the World Climate Exercise, so similar to what I've just gone through here today. And then all the different materials you can use. And we have what we call a quick start guide, so you can select this and download it, and you'll get all the materials you need in just one download file. And then also make sure to download C-Roads World Climate. But you can also find all the different materials. So if you're briefing materials, this is what you give participants to outline what their negotiating position is. Proposal form to help them fill that out with each negotiation round. Labels for the tables so they know what role they're playing. Sometimes we also create name tags. And then presentation slides. So you can download, and we have tons of different slides that you can use to give your audience background on climate change information, and also talk about different trends, talk some about hope. We have some slides in there to try and build some hope, all that kind of thing that you can check out. So any questions from anyone else? And I am curious, what you all are planning to do with the World Climate Simulation. We're always excited to hear how people are putting it to use across the world. Anyone have any plans to run it with a class that they're working with or a group of people? You can write that into the question box. And I will add also that we are also conducting research on the learning impact of the World Climate Simulation. So we're working with, again, Professor Juliet Rooney-Varga at the University of Massachusetts Lowell, because it's a very different learning experience than what a lot of people get when they're, oftentimes we sit in lectures, and especially in school settings, a role-playing simulation is a very different way of learning than a PowerPoint presentation. So we have surveys that we're encouraging facilitators to give their participants before and after the simulation to just test what they've learned, what they've taken away from the experience. So far, our preliminary findings find that it's a pretty transformational activity. Oftentimes, participants will remember the exercise many years later, and we have some evidence that it makes people more inspired to take action on climate change and better able to recognize some of the things that we need to do to address it. So that's definitely one. I see someone says they're going to do a college level class for environmental science majors and a business major. That's fantastic. I heard recently we work closely with Professor Johnston at MIT, and he runs it quite oftentimes with business students there, and also executive MBA students. And they even have a sustainability minor that has world climate as just part of the curriculum now. So that's pretty exciting. Here's somebody else that's going to use it in a climate science class. That's excellent. If you're interested in the survey, I will show you on the website where you can find that. So here I am on the facilitators resources and materials page. And you can see it says evaluating world climate. So if you click there, you get directed to this page and then help us to evaluate world climate. That'll send you over to a page at the University of Massachusetts Lowell where you can access all the surveys and information on that if you want to help us with our research project. We also encourage you to register your world climate events. So if you are planning on one, please make sure to come to our website and just fill in the information here to let us know that the simulation has happened. This helps us, know how many people out in the world are using it, which helps us in our fundraising and being able to put the support that is needed and to keep continuing to run webinars like these for free and other things. If you do register your event, you can see we have a map on the website. It's pretty cool. That shows all these different locations where world climate has happened. You can see all across the world. And maybe you're listening into the webinar and sitting in Moscow or somewhere in Russia. You can help us add a pin out in Russia or maybe northern Canada. We've got a few gaps there. So we look to you all to help us fill in all of these gaps all in different places and continue to add more pins in the places where we already have many. It's a really wonderful effort to see how much enthusiasm and how many different people working with very different audiences around the world have found this simulation to be accessible and useful in their work. You can see actually the numbers I had on my slide are a little out of date. We're up to 34,000 participants as of a month ago, and over 686 events. Wow, that's pretty incredible. Any other questions as we wrap up here? I will say we've got tons of resources here on the website. I'm also happy to answer any questions, and my colleague Grace Mora, she's based in Nairobi. She's also available for questions too. Here are both of our email addresses if you want to get in touch with us and have questions. And also, like I said before, a lot of the work around developing this tool and putting it to use out in the world is thanks to people like you who have facilitated it with groups and have continued to run with it and help spread it. Just today, I came across a article written by a high school student in North Carolina who had participated in world climate. And in her blog post, she had talked about how she was playing the European Union and they had decided to give their chairs to the other developing countries who initially started exercise without any chairs and were sitting on the floor. And so they thought as an act of goodwill, they would give their chairs away. And then the other developing countries decided to give their chairs to China in exchange for some financing. And the EU decided they wanted their chairs back. And the Chinese didn't want to give their chairs away that they had been given. And so drama ensued from there, and you can imagine that was a fun exercise for a high school student. Sometimes you see the chairs become a big issue. I didn't mention this earlier, but they're also on the website. We have briefing statements available for people to play environmental activists or fossil fuel lobbyists. So this can be another way to bring in different roles, and this can sometimes be a lot of fun. You'll have I've seen cases where the climate activists have made signs, they've turned off the lights, they've staged demonstrations after seeing that there's slow progress from countries and taking action, and they'll make the moral case for action on climate change. Also recently, in light of all the news around the US's role within the Paris Agreement, we created a new briefing that we were sort of experimenting with, but we put it up on the website in case you find it useful too, for US cities and states. So this would be like maybe halfway through the negotiation, you have the governor of California show up, and he or she could make an announcement about US and cities and states are doing on climate to see if that helps move the negotiations. But again, you can make it as simple or as complex as you want. So maybe you do just want to keep it simple. Keep it to the three regions: developed countries, developing A countries, and developing B. This has been run by students. It's been run for middle school students. It's been run in very large groups. It's been run in much smaller groups. It's really a pretty flexible thing, and we definitely encourage you to bend it and shape it to what makes sense for your group. But we always do encourage our facilitators to take on the role playing aspect and take it seriously. As you take on the role and are playing the role of UN Secretary General, it helps your participants play their roles well too. But yeah, that's the main part of it. We have a Facebook group for World Climate Facilitators that you can join. We also have a Twitter where we send out links to things like this blog post that I mentioned, and news about world climates that you can stay posted on too. But yeah, thank you all so much for joining today, and hopefully this was useful, and I'm excited to see your registered events come in, and wish you good luck in running them. I am available if you all have any questions. But otherwise, thanks for your time, and thanks for everything you're doing out there to create conversations and awareness about what we need to do on climate change.